Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the anatomy of war. We're going to unpack the fascinating science behind what actually drives nations to take up arms against one another. Drawing on hard data from the UN and the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or SIPRI, we're breaking down the mechanics of how peace unravels and, honestly, more importantly, how it can be saved.
Let's kick things off by busting a pretty major myth. You know, when we look back at history, it's so tempting to point to one single dramatic event, like the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and say, yep, that's exactly what started the war. But the data? Well, it tells a very different story. Conflicts rarely just ignite from a spontaneous spark. Instead, they're the result of a compounding powder keg of political, economic, and historical factors that have been quietly building up in the background for years.
So, that brings us to the big question for our explainer today. If it's not just a single random spark, what actually builds that geopolitical powder keg? Like, what takes a routine diplomatic spat and turns it into a full-scale military conflict? Well, here's our roadmap to figure that out. First, we'll look at the anatomy of a conflict. Then, fighting over tangible things. After that, history, pride, and politics. Next, escalation and deadly mistakes. And finally, preventing the unthinkable. All right, part one. The anatomy of a conflict and building that powder keg. Let's move right into part two, fighting over tangible things like territory and resources. Now, according to the Uppsala Conflict Data Program and the Journal of Politics, unresolved territorial disputes are among the absolute strongest predictors of interstate war. We're talking borders, mountain regions, maritime boundaries, and airspace. Historically, nations have almost gone to war over completely uninhabited rocks out in the ocean, or tiny, seemingly barren strips of desert. And you might wonder why. Well, because a state with an unresolved territorial claim is statistically way more likely to fight. Even the tiniest pieces of land hold immense strategic value, or just deep national pride. And then there's resource scarcity, which acts as this massive threat multiplier. It's not just about fighting over oil and natural gas anymore. When you compound things with climate change and rapid population growth, nations are intensely competing over the absolute basics: fresh water, fisheries, agricultural land. And let's not forget the rare earth minerals sitting inside the very device you're using to watch this right now. Control over these resources transforms from a simple economic advantage into a completely vital national security issue.
Which brings us to part three, history, pride, and politics, the human element.
Because you see, physical land and resources, that's really only half the story. Often, the roots of today's conflicts stretch back decades or even centuries. Research from the Annual Reviews of Political Science shows that historical grievances, like arbitrarily drawn colonial borders that completely ignored local ethnic groups, create these recurring cycles of tension. Those unresolved historical disputes, they never really vanish. Instead, leaders leverage them to stir up national identity in the present, which dramatically increases the temperature in the room. And that leverages a highly powerful, invisible force in international relations: nationalism. Put simply, nationalism is a strong pride and loyalty toward one's country. Political science institutes frequently flag identity politics as a major, recurring contributor to interstate disputes. But we really have to understand where healthy pride ends and real danger begins. It helps to think of it as a spectrum. On one end, patriotism is this deeply positive force that unites a community and fosters growth. But on the exact opposite end, extreme nationalism outright refuses compromise. It views neighboring countries purely as enemies rather than potential partners, and it is incredibly effective at rallying public support for aggressive military action. When nationalist rhetoric heavily dominates the airwaves, diplomacy just gets silenced. We also absolutely cannot ignore what's happening inside a country's own borders. Severe economic crises, massive public protests, or highly contested elections heavily influence foreign policy. Political scientists actually call this the diversionary theory of war. You can picture it as a wag-the-dog scenario where leaders adopt really aggressive, tough-talking foreign policies simply to distract the public from domestic failures. It adds immense stress to an already fragile geopolitical landscape. Moving on to part four. Escalation and deadly mistakes, or lighting the match. So, we've got the fuel, we've built the powder keg, but what actually lights the match? Well, we look to a concept introduced by scholars John Hertz and Robert Jervis. It's called the security dilemma. Imagine you decide to build a taller fence around your house just to feel safe. Your neighbor sees it, feels threatened, and buys a guard dog. Now you feel threatened by the dog, so you install security cameras. In international relations, this is a tragic misunderstanding.
One country takes purely defensive actions, but its neighbors misinterpret them as aggressive threats and arm themselves in response. And that paranoia spirals incredibly fast into an arms race. Neighboring nations begin desperately matching each other's military spending, stockpiling advanced weapons, missiles, naval fleets, air power, and even invisible cyber capabilities. Organizations like SICRI consistently warn that this continuous growth in military hardware drastically increases strategic instability. Suddenly, everyone is armed to the teeth, and everyone is incredibly nervous.
And when everyone is nervous, accidents happen. With modern multi-domain operations moving at literal lightning speed, conflicts aren't always intentional. The escalation happens terrifyingly fast. Step 1, a simple navigation error, maybe an aircraft collision, or a faulty intelligence report occurs. Step 2, leaders who are already on edge panic. Step 3, and this is the crucial one, communication channels completely close. Finally, step 4, with no one talking, the situation rapidly escalates into an accidental war. Just one tiny domino knocks over the whole board. Which leads us to part 5, preventing the unthinkable, the cure for conflict. That accidental escalation is definitely a terrifying scenario, but there is a cure. Because conflict is a structured process born of specific factors, it can absolutely be prevented. The greatest danger we face is silence. History repeatedly shows us that wars begin right after diplomacy breaks down. When talks fail and leaders are left in the dark trying to guess each other's intentions, the likelihood of violence literally skyrockets. Good open communication is really the only thing that pierces the paranoia of that security dilemma. The United Nations Charter and decades of peer-reviewed peace research all point to the exact same conclusion here. Maintaining open lines of communication through active diplomacy, mediation, and negotiation isn't just some political theater. It is our absolute strongest shield against war. It sounds simple, right? But it requires immense, ongoing effort from everyone involved. Let's take a look at the concrete tools governments actually have at their disposal. First, crisis hotlines. These allow direct, immediate communication between military leaders to clarify accidents and stop that deadly domino effect in its tracks. Then, committing to arms control agreements limits those dangerous stockpiles we talked about, building actual mutual trust rather than paranoia. And finally, regional organizations foster deep economic cooperation, which makes war so financially disastrous that no one even wants to pull the trigger. So, the science of conflict is incredibly clear. The warning signs, things like territorial disputes, resource strain, extreme nationalism, and arms races, they are completely measurable. And the diplomatic tools to stop them are sitting right in front of us. The only question left is, will the nations of the world actually have the wisdom to pick up the phone before the silence takes over? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning and keep asking those big questions.